By the mid-1960s, the Canadian nickel was facing an existential challenge. On the surface, the 5-cent coin of 1966 looked strong, stable, and familiar, unchanged in design and still struck from Canada's own nickel. But beneath that surface, cracks were forming. The world was changing. Prices were rising, resources were strained, and governments around the globe were being forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The cost of minting coins was beginning to rival, and in some cases exceed, their face value. For the Canadian nickel, it was the beginning of what numismatists now call the near-meltdown crisis. When Canada decided in 1922 to strike its 5-cent pieces from pure nickel, it was a logical and patriotic choice. Nickel was abundant in Canada, inexpensive at the time, and a source of national pride. For decades, the decision worked well. But by the 1960s, things had changed. Nickel was no longer cheap. Global demand for the metal was soaring. Stainless steel production, military applications during the Cold War, and new technologies all required nickel. As a result, its price on world markets began to climb steadily. For Canada, this posed a unique problem. Unlike other nations that used cheaper alloys for their 5-cent coins, Canada was minting each one from solid nickel. As the price of the metal increased, the cost of producing each coin began to eat into, and in some cases nearly equal, its value. In 1922, when the nickel first switched to nickel metal, 5 cents could buy a loaf of bread or a streetcar ride. By 1966, a nickel still had value, a chocolate bar, a bottle of pop, or a bus fare in some cities, but its power was shrinking year by year. This created a double squeeze. On one hand, the metal was becoming more expensive. On the other, the coin was becoming less useful in daily commerce. The very logic of the nickel was being questioned. Could Canada continue striking pure nickel coins? Was it time to switch to a cheaper alloy? Should the size of the coin be reduced to save on materials? These questions weren't unique to Canada. In the United States, similar debates raged over the penny and the nickel. In Britain, preparations for decimalization raised questions about coinage metals and sizes. Across the world, rising costs were forcing governments to confront the same issue: how to balance tradition, practicality, and economics. For Canada, the question was particularly sensitive. Nickel wasn't just a commodity, it was a national resource, tied to Sudbury's identity and Canada's place in global industry. To abandon nickel in the 5-cent piece felt, to some, like abandoning part of the country's heritage. Most Canadians in 1966 had little idea of the crisis brewing around their nickels. To them, the coins were still plentiful, familiar, and useful. But occasional news articles hinted at the problem, reporting on the rising value of nickel and speculating on the future of Canada's coins. Collectors and numismatists, however, were more attuned. They knew that changes in metal composition often produced rarities and varieties, and many kept a close watch on developments. By the mid-1960s, Canadian officials considered several possibilities. 1. Reduce the size of the nickel. A smaller coin would require less metal, lowering costs. But this risked public confusion and resistance, as Canadians were deeply familiar with the size and feel of the nickel. 2. Switch to a cheaper alloy. This was the most practical solution. By replacing pure nickel with a nickel-copper blend, or even a plated steel core, the mint could dramatically cut costs. But this would mean abandoning a tradition that had lasted for more than 4 decades. 3. Continue with pure nickel and absorb the costs. This was the simplest option in the short term but unsustainable in the long run. In 1966, the government chose not to make immediate changes. The coin remained pure nickel, its specifications unchanged. But the pressure was building, and officials knew a reckoning was near. In hindsight, 1966 can be seen as a year when the nickel narrowly escaped transformation. Had metal prices risen just a little higher, or inflation accelerated a little faster, Canada might have altered the 5-cent coin sooner. Instead, the nickel carried on in its traditional form until the early 1980s, when Canada finally introduced a smaller, copper-nickel version. By 2000, the transition was complete. Plated steel coins replaced solid nickel entirely. But in 1966, All of that was still in the future. Canadians could still take pride in a 5-cent piece. That was not only a symbol of their nation, but literally struck from its natural wealth. Economic realities mattered. Symbolism and tradition were important, but they could not override the cold arithmetic of rising costs. Coins, after all, were tools of commerce. If their production became uneconomical, changes had to be made. At the same time, the crisis revealed how deeply coins were tied to national identity. Canadians resisted the idea of abandoning pure nickel not only for practical reasons, but because it felt UN Canadian. The nickel was more than currency. It was a reflection of Sudbury's mines, the beaver's industriousness, and Canada's pride in its resources. Today, collectors look back on it with appreciation. It represents the last stable years before change swept through Canada's coinage, a moment when the old ways still held fast, even as the world shifted around them. The near-meltdown crisis was a warning, a reminder that even the smallest coin carries the weight of global markets, national pride, and economic reality. In 1966, Canada held its ground, but the storm clouds were already gathering. Most Canadians who spent a 1966 nickel never thought twice about it. To them, it was just another small coin, 5 cents in change, a jingle in the pocket, a payment for candy or a bus ride. But in the world of numismatics, not all nickels are created equal. Among the millions of 1966 5-cent pieces struck in Ottawa, a handful were different. A tiny mistake here, a quirk of die polishing there, and suddenly a coin that was worth only 5 cents at the counter could be worth hundreds or even thousands. In the collector's market, to the untrained eye, all coins of a given year look the same. But collectors know that minting is never a perfect science. Dies wear down. Engravers make adjustments. Machines slip, or planchets misfeed. The result? Variance, intentional or unintentional differences in design, and errors. The accidental oddities that slip through quality control. For collectors, these quirks are treasures. They capture the human side of minting. The reality that even in a world of precision, imperfection finds a way. One of the most important varieties of the 1966. Nickel lies not in the beaver on the reverse, but in the Queen's portrait on the obverse. Around the rim of the coin, tiny dots, called beads, form a decorative border. In 1966, 2 versions were produced. A small beads, more numerous and closely spaced. A large beads, fewer in number but slightly larger and more widely spaced. The difference may seem minor, but for collectors it is significant. The large beads obverse was struck in smaller numbers, making it scarcer and more sought after today. This wasn't unique to the nickel. Other Canadian denominations, in 1966, including the cent, also display small and large bead varieties. They represent subtle adjustments made during die preparation, a reminder that even tiny details can have lasting numismatic consequences. On some nickels, the 1966 appears slightly closer to the rim. On others, it is more centered. When combined with the small versus large bead varieties, this creates a fascinating puzzle. For numismatists, a set of microvariations that reward careful study. A die break occurs when a small crack forms in the die, leaving a raised line or blob of metal on the coin. A cud is even more striking. A piece of the die actually breaks away, leaving a blank, misshapen area on the finished coin. 1966 nickels with these errors are rare, but they exist. Each is unique, since the exact form of the break or cud depends on the moment of failure. To collectors, they are fascinating anomalies, coins that carry the scars of the minting process itself. Other known errors from 1966 include double strikes and off-center strikes. In a double strike, the planchet is struck twice by the dies, producing a ghosted or overlapping image. In an off-center strike, the planchet is not properly aligned, resulting in a coin where the design is shifted, with part of the blank surface still visible. Such errors are usually caught and melted down at the mint, but occasionally, a few slip out into circulation, where they become the holy grail of collectors. A 1966 nickel with a dramatic off-center strike, for instance, can be worth dozens, or even hundreds, of times its face value, depending on condition. Occasionally, however, something went wrong. a proof like 1966 nickel with haze. Spotting, or even a striking flaw can attract attention today. To collectors, such oddities are doubly valuable. Not only are they mint errors, but they come from sets that were supposed to represent the mint's highest quality. So how rare are these 1966 variants and errors? A large beads nickel, MS condition considered scarcer than the small beads, often commanding premiums of several times face value. Air die breaks and cuds, unique by nature, valued based on size, placement, and eye appeal. Air double strikes are off-center errors, very rare. Prices vary widely but can reach into the hundreds of dollars. A proof like oddities, less common, but prized by specialists. For collectors, the thrill lies not only in the monetary value but in the hunt. The possibility that an ordinary-looking 1966 nickel, found in a jar or inherited from a relative, might actually be something extraordinary. Most people glance at a coin and see only its face value. But a collector sees more. They notice the bead spacing, the alignment of the date, the tiny raised line of a die crack. To them, each detail tells a story of the mint, of the machinery, of the moment in time when that particular coin was struck. The 1966 nickel, with its mix of varieties and occasional errors, is a perfect case study. It shows how even a mass-produced object, one of nearly 19 million struck, can contain mysteries and treasures. In the end, the 1966 nickel reminds us that history is not only written in books and monuments but also in the smallest details of everyday objects. A coin meant for spending can, by accident or variation, become a rare artifact. What was once worth 5 cents may one day sit in a collector's case, valued not only for its rarity but for the story it tells about Canada's mint, its people, and its time. The rare variants of the 1966 nickel prove that even the smallest coin holds hidden worlds. A misplaced bead, a broken die, a doubled image. These are the secrets that turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. In 1966, the Canadian nickel was more than just a piece of metal. It was a small but essential companion in daily life, a coin that linked the economy to the experiences of ordinary Canadians. It was the price of candy, the cost of a phone call, the fare for a short bus ride. It was the coin parents handed to their children as pocket money, and the change that clinked in purses and pockets across the country. The 1966 5-cent piece wasn't just part of commerce. It was part of culture. In neighborhoods from Vancouver to Halifax, children walked in after school with nickels burning holes in their pockets. They could choose from shelves lined with penny candies, chocolate bars, packs of gum, and bottles of soda, all priced with nickels in mind. A candy bar often cost a nickel. A bottle of Coca-Cola was around 10 cents, 2 nickels. A handful of penny candies could be bought for just 1 coin, with change left over. The nickel was the gateway to childhood pleasures. For many Canadians, memories of the 1960s are inseparable from the ritual of trading. Nickels for sweets at the neighborhood store. In some Canadian cities, 5 cents could cover a short streetcar or bus ride. For workers commuting to factories, for students heading to school, or for families traveling across town. The nickel was a ticket to movement. In an era before mobile phones, the payphone was essential. Located on street corners, in restaurants, and at gas stations, payphones often required a nickel to make a local call. Entertainment, too, was tied to the nickel. Our arcade machines and pinball games often cost a nickel per play. A nickel in the jukebox filled diners and dance halls with the latest rock and roll hits. Comic books, a favorite of children, were priced at 12 cents in 1966, just over 2 nickels. For Canadian children in the 1960s, the nickel was also an introduction to money management. Parents often gave small allowances in nickels and dimes, teaching kids the value of saving, budgeting, and spending. A jar of nickels on the dresser represented not just pocket change, but independence and possibility. A child could save up nickels for a toy, spend them instantly on candy, or trade them with friends. These small decisions taught the basics of economics long before school lessons did. The nickel also left its mark on Canadian language and idioms. Expressions like worth every nickel or not a plugged nickel reflected the coin's role as a standard of small but real value. Even in casual speech, the nickel was shorthand for fairness. worth, and everyday practicality. Beyond daily life, the 5-cent coin symbolized Canadian identity. The beaver on its reverse was a constant reminder of the country's heritage, echoing the fur trade and the natural world that shaped Canada's history. Every time a Canadian spent a nickel, they held a tiny piece of national storytelling, a coin that linked the past to the present, heritage to habit. For immigrants arriving in the 1960s, handling Canadian nickels was part of learning the rhythms of their new home. The coin wasn't just money, it was a cultural touchstone, part of what it meant to participate in Canadian life. By 1966, inflation meant that the coin could no longer buy as much as it once had. Candy prices were creeping up, bus fares were rising, and comic books would soon climb in cost. Yet the nickel remained essential, even as its individual power diminished. It was the building block of daily transactions, the unit that tied together cents and dimes, prices and payments. Today, for Canadians who grew up in the 1960s, the nickel evokes deep nostalgia. They remember the feel of it in their pockets, the sound of it clattering on store counters, the satisfaction of dropping it into a jukebox or a pinball machine. To them, the 1966 nickel is not just a coin from history books. It is a memory of Saturday afternoons, corner stores, first phone calls, and childhood freedoms bought with a simple 5-cent piece. Ultimately, the 1966 nickel shows us that coins are not just about economics, they are about culture. They shape habits, anchor memories, and weave into the stories of everyday life. The nickel was small, yes, but in 1966, it was everywhere, a constant companion in Canadian society. It was the coin of childhood, the coin of convenience, the coin of connection. And that made it priceless. In 1966, the nickel was more than metal. It was the rhythm of Canadian life, captured in a single coin. Time has a way of transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. When the 1966 Canadian 5-cent piece was minted, it was simply a coin, millions of them struck for everyday use. Yet decades later, these same coins have become objects of fascination for numismatists around the world. Today, the 1966 nickel is no longer just 5 cents. It is a collectible, a window into history, and for some, a prized possession worth far more than its face value. Every collector's journey with the 1966 nickel begins in the same place, circulation. 4 years after its release, the coin remained common in Canadian change. But as time passed, attrition took its toll. Coins were worn down, lost, melted, or hoarded. By the 1980s and 1990s, sharp-eyed collectors realized that uncirculated 1966 nickels were becoming harder to find. Today, nearly 60 years later, truly pristine examples are scarce, making them desirable additions to collections. In numismatics, condition is everything. The grading scale, from poor, P1, to mint state, MS70, provides a universal language for describing coins. For the 1966 nickel, this spectrum makes all the difference. As circulated examples, good to very fine. These are common and usually only worth face value or a modest premium. They bear the marks of decades of use, from pocket wear to surface scratches. Are about uncirculated, -50 Australian dollars to -58 Australian dollars. Coins with only the slightest wear, often kept aside by chance rather than intention, begin to attract collector interest. A mint state, MS60 to MS65 bright. Uncirculated examples with sharp detail are where value begins to climb. A high-end mint state, MS66 and above the rarest survivors, virtually flawless and often from original mint rolls or proof-like sets, can fetch impressive premiums. For collectors, the hunt is not just for the coin itself, but for the coin in its best possible state, a snapshot of 1966, preserved through time. These sets, sold directly to collectors, featured coins struck with polished dies on specially prepared planchets. The result was sharp detail, mirror-like fields, and frosted reliefs, qualities that set them apart from everyday circulation strikes. Today, proof-like 1966 nickels are highly prized. They often serve as the best preserved examples, offering collectors a glimpse of the coin as it looked when first struck. Within these sets, some nickels even display subtle die polishing marks, cameo contrasts, or other traits that make them unique, and all the more collectible. Collectors are also drawn to the variants and minting eras of 1966, explored in the previous chapter. A small beads versus large beads. The large beads variety is scarcer and commands a higher premium. Air die breaks and cuds, each one of a kind, valued for its dramatic appearance. A double strikes and off-center errors, rare but spectacular, instantly catching the eye of specialists. The variety landscape transforms. The 1966 nickel from a single coin into an entire collecting field. A complete collection might include not just one example, but multiple variations, each representing a different chapter of the year's minting history. So what is a 1966 nickel worth today? As circulated examples, typically just face value, unless the coin has an unusual variety or error. A mint state coins, depending on grade, anywhere from a few dollars to over $100. A proof-like specimens often fetch $10 to $30, with cameo examples commanding more. A rare variants and errors can range from $50 for minor varieties to several $100 for dramatic errors or high-grade large bead examples. Of course, the true value lies not just in market price but in collector passion. For many, the 1966 nickel is worth more than money. It is worth the story it carries. What makes the 1966 nickel so appealing to collectors today? A historical context, struck during a period of national transformation in Canada, just a year before centennial celebrations and the introduction of new coinage. A design significance, the long-running beaver reverse, paired with Arnold Machen's first portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, makes it a classic mid-century Canadian coin. Error accessibility. While rare errors are valuable, the coin itself is still affordable, allowing new collectors to start with modest examples and grow their collections over time. A nostalgia. For many Canadians, the 1966 nickel is a childhood memory, a relic of a simpler time. For collectors, preservation is key. Coins should be stored in acid-free holders or albums, away from humidity, heat, and handling. Gloves should be used when touching high-grade examples to prevent fingerprints and oils from damaging the surface. Some collectors even seek out original mint rolls or unopened proof-like sets from 1966, treasures that hold the promise of untouched, pristine nickels inside. While the 1966 nickel is most meaningful in Canada, its appeal extends worldwide. Collectors from the United States, Europe, and beyond often include Canadian coins in their collections, drawn by the country's rich designs and high-quality minting. In this global numismatic community, the 1966 nickel stands as both a representative of Canadian history and a universally admired example of mid-20th century coinage. As time passes, the 1966 nickel will only grow scarcer in high grades. Circulated examples will remain common, but pristine specimens, rare varieties, and proof-like issues will continue to rise in desirability. For collectors of tomorrow, the coin will represent not just the 1960s, but the legacy of Canadian numismatics as a whole. From pocket change to prized collectible, the 1966 nickel has traveled far. What was once just 5 cents in a child's hand is now a piece of history, cherished by those who see more than metal. Coins are among the smallest artifacts we carry, yet their stories are among the greatest. The 1966 Canadian 5-cent piece may seem modest at first glance, a beaver, a queen, a denomination so small that it hardly stirs the imagination. But within this nickel lies a legacy far greater than its size suggests. It is a coin that speaks of history, of culture, of design, and of the everyday lives of Canadians. It is a coin that, 6 decades later, still has something to say. To understand the legacy of this coin, we must return to the year of its birth. Canada in 1966 was a nation on the edge of transformation. Expo 67 was just around the corner, promising to put Canada on the world stage. National pride was surging. The country was preparing for its centennial, looking both backward to its roots and forward to its future. The nickel of 1966 captures this moment perfectly. On one side, the youthful Queen Elizabeth II, newly immortalized in Arnold Machen's portrait, represented continuity with tradition and monarchy. On the other, the beaver, unchanged since 1937, symbolized Canada's natural heritage and industrious spirit. This was Canada in miniature, a blend of old and new, heritage and modernity. The beaver, long a cornerstone of Canadian identity, tied the 1966 nickel to the fur trade and to the natural world that had shaped the country's history. Every time the coin passed from hand to hand, it carried with it a reminder of Canada's roots. The Queen, meanwhile, represented not just monarchy but the nation's place in a broader commonwealth. Her youthful portrait, fresh, approachable, elegant, reflected a modern monarchy, just as Canada itself was becoming a modern nation. The legacy of the 1966 nickel is also written in the memories of those who used it. For some, it recalls the jingle of pocket change as children dashed to corner stores, trading nickels for candy or comic books. For others, it evokes bus rides, payphone calls, or jukebox tunes. It was not a rare coin when it was minted. It was everywhere. But in its very ubiquity, it became woven into the fabric of Canadian life. The nickel's legacy, then, is not just numismatic. It is cultural. It is emotional. It is human. Part of the 1966 nickel's enduring legacy lies in its richness for collectors. The large beads versus small beads varieties created intrigue and challenge, encouraging numismatists to look closer, to study, to compare. Error coins, off-centers, double strikes, die breaks, turned ordinary pieces into objects of fascination, each one a story in itself. These varieties remind us that even in mass production, uniqueness emerges. Each coin carries the potential for individuality, and in that, for deeper meaning. Collectors today preserve and study the 1966 nickel not simply for its market value, but because it represents the joy of discovery. It exemplifies what makes numismatics so compelling: the ability to find history and mystery in the smallest details. For grandparents, it is a coin they once spent in their youth. For parents, it may be a coin they remember slipping into piggy banks. For today's young collectors, it is a piece of the past to be rediscovered, studied, and cherished. Coins are national storytellers, and the 1966 nickel tells its tale with quiet persistence. It tells of Canada's natural heritage through the beaver. It tells of monarchy and continuity through the Queen's portrait. It tells of mid-century design, when craftsmanship and symbolism met in everyday objects. And it tells of the lives of millions of Canadians, ordinary people who earned, spent, and saved it. The legacy of the 1966 nickel is not found in vaults or museums alone. It is found in memory, in culture, and in the stories Canadians still tell about it. As we look forward, what role will this coin play in the future? With the rise of digital payments and the gradual decline of coin usage, the physical nickel may one day disappear from circulation entirely. Yet the 1966 nickel will remain preserved in collections, cherished as a relic of an era when coins mattered deeply in everyday life. For numismatists, it will continue to be a point of study, its varieties, errors, and proof-like issues offering endless fascination. For historians, it will stand as a symbol of 1960s Canada, a tangible link to a pivotal decade. And for ordinary Canadians, it will remain a nostalgic token, evoking simpler times and youthful memories. The legacy of the 1966 nickel is more than monetary. It is historical, cultural, personal. It reminds us that coins are not just metal, they are stories struck in miniature, meant to travel, to circulate, to connect people across time. What began as 5 cents in 1966 has become something far greater, a chapter in Canada's national story, a symbol of a country balancing tradition and change, a memory for those who lived it, a collectible for those who preserve it. The nickel's journey from pocket change to treasured artifact mirrors Canada's own journey, growing, adapting, and enduring. The narrator's final words linger as the camera closes on the shining coin in its case. The 1966 nickel is not just a coin. It is a legacy. Thanks for watching.